Welcome to the 10th and final episode in a Legendarium series about the life and reign of King Edward III. In Part 10, The Deaths of Kings, we will talk about the twilight years of King Edward III and how they were marred by political and military failure. After his wife's death in 1369, King Edward III himself suffered from poor health. After 1370, he relied on expensive surgeons and doctors to keep him alive. As his family and friends died off around him, Edward III began to sink into a closed household life, having outlived his greatest victories. Nonetheless, as the French king besieged his son's duchy in Aquitaine, Edward III summoned a parliament and convinced the magnates to resume the war against France. But unlike the past wars, Edward III failed to find strong war captains. City after city in Aquitaine simply opened their doors to the French. By 1370, Edward the Black Prince, son and heir of King Edward III, became too sick to ride a horse. Nevertheless, he was so inflamed by the French capture of Limoges that he pulled himself out of bed and ordered his servants to carry him down to the city via litter. In mid-September 1370, the Black Prince arrived at Limoges, which surrendered to the Duke of Berry of France. And after a long siege, the Black Prince sacked the town as punishment for its desertion. According to chroniclers of the time, about 300 people died during the sacking and burning of the town, no small loss. Yet the French chronicler Fossery embroidered his account and exaggerated the number of deaths tenfold. By doing so, he inflamed French opinion against the English occupation, and the supposed deaths of 3,000 people at Limoges unfairly darkened the Black Prince's reputation for generations. Yet in his writings, Froissart did capture the horror of a medieval siege. He wrote, "They entered the city on foot, with their companies and their hordes of hangers-on. All of them were equipped for evil. It was heart-rending to see the inhabitants throwing themselves to the ground as he passed, crying, 'Mercy, noble lord, mercy!' He was so enraged that he heard them not. The looting did not stop until the whole city was stripped and left in flames." However, within a year, the Black Prince would trouble the French no more, being too sickly to remain on the continent. And within a year of his departure, nothing remained of the vast English duchy of Aquitaine except a coastal strip that was under siege by the French. The English made two more attempts to invade Aquitaine by sea. One fleet under the Earl of Pembroke was captured. Another had to return to port because of adverse winds, and this was the last campaign that the once vigorous Edward III led in person. After this failure, he retreated into near seclusion, his mind and body failing. Command effectively passed to his younger son, John of Gaunt, who did not prove himself the equal of his father or elder brother. John of Gaunt carried out a long raid across the whole of France, north to south, in 1373, known as the Grand Chevauchée. Yet this massive expedition only delayed the collapse of English fortunes. While they were struggling with little success against the rising tide of French national feeling, Edward's lack of money made him grant licenses to the English wool trade to Italian merchants. Members of his inner circle grew rich by selling them in exchange for hefty bribes, and all the while French privateers harassed English shipping in the Channel so much that London wool magnates had to hire their own private fleets just to protect their wool barges bound for the continent. In 1375, King Edward gladly made a truce with the French, which lasted until his death. By it, the only important possessions remaining in English hands were the cities of Calais, Bordeaux, Bayonne, and Brest, a tiny shadow of the once vast empire he ruled in France. By then, Edward had come under the influence of corrupt retainers, none more influential or infamous than Alice Perrers. As the king's mistress, she manipulated the aging and senile king into gifting her estates, castles, and new titles. At a tournament, she garbed herself in magnificent gowns and jewels, and presented herself as the Lady of the Sun. To the king's subjects, who were impoverished by French attacks and failures in war, her displays were truly infuriating. Against this backdrop of popular anger and upheaval, the good Parliament of 1376 met. They chose Peter de Lamar, a courageous, articulate, and well-connected knight, to speak on behalf of reform. At the good Parliament, he boldly demanded the prosecution of Edward's favorites, especially Alice Perrers. Edward's favorites tried desperately to save themselves. One of them, Richard Lyon, even tried to bribe the Black Prince with a barrel of gold to save him from the good Parliament. The Black Prince sent it back with the words, "He has given us nothing that he has not taken from my royal father." We are not certain how the Black Prince died. It could have been anything from nephritis to cirrhosis or even edema. Some scholars believe he simply died from old battle wounds. Regardless of how he met his end, the heir of Edward III, Edward the Black Prince, died before his father in June 1376 at the age of 45. Chronicler Raphael Holinshed wrote that Edward believed the early death of his son was God's punishment for his usurping of his father's crown almost 50 years ago. On the Black Prince's deathbed, his prince begged the dying prince to ask forgiveness from God and all those he injured during his life. He did that and more, with one of his last acts being to turn over his royal hunting forest in Cheshire to the people there, so they would be liberated from oppressive forest laws that granted deer more rights than men. The Black Prince's retainers laid him to rest in his war kit, including his surcoat, helmet, shield, and gauntlets, preserved in bronze. And so the Black Prince was laid to rest, ready for battle, as he lived his life. His tomb would be vandalized during the English Civil War by Cromwell's men. With that, all eyes turned to Edward III's grandson, Richard of Bordeaux. And without the Black Prince to stop the good Parliament, they exiled Alice Perrers, Richard Lyon, and other of the king's retainers from the royal presence. For this, they would be celebrated by their countrymen as champions of good government. In September 1376, the king began suffering from an abscess. He made a brief recovery and made his final public appearance during the good Parliament. The frail king was dressed in golden cloth by his servants and tied up to a post so he could wave to the magnates who sailed up to his hunting lodge. And even before his death, Edward's grandson, Richard of Bordeaux, attended his first parliament and took oaths of loyalty from the magnates. In a fragile condition, Edward III suffered a stroke at Sheen on June 12, 1377. According to lore, Alice Perrers took the rings from his fingers before his body grew cold. The royal family buried Edward III in Westminster Abbey next to his beloved wife, Queen Philippa. His gilt bronze effigy lies on top of a tomb chest with 6 niches along, each long side holding miniature effigies of the king's 12 children. Edward's wooden funeral effigy, modeled on his death mask, survives at Westminster Abbey. It has a twisted mouth, suggesting the effects of a stroke upon the aging king. That wraps things up for this Legendarium series about King Edward III. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.